It's December 2nd, 1993. On a rooftop in Medellin, a cornered man faced a definitive choice. His entire life, an empire of violence and cash, had led him to this moment. The sound of gunfire filled the air, and seconds later, the most feared figure in Colombia lay lifeless. A final shot to the ear ended his reign. But before we delve into the story of the man who forever changed Colombia's destiny, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the stories that have shaped our world. And tell us in the comments, was Escobar just a brutal, merciless criminal, or a bold strategist who, from the depths of misery, wove an empire capable of challenging the entire state? Join me as we explore the origins of the man whose cunning and ambition made him one of the most influential and enigmatic figures in modern history. The story of Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria begins on December 1st, 1949 in Rio Negro, Antioquia, a municipality in the heart of Colombia. He wasn't born into opulence, nor into the most extreme poverty, but into a rural, lower middle-class environment that would shape his worldview. His father, Abel de Jesus Escobar Echeverri, was a humble farmer who lived off the land and honest work, a countryman with his feet firmly on the ground. His mother, Hermilda Gaviria de Escobar, was a school teacher, a figure of moral authority and a great influence in her children's lives. She is credited with Pablo's obsession with education and knowledge, although he himself would choose a very different path. The family, which would soon grow with the birth of his siblings, lived in a modest country house that was, nevertheless, a refuge. However, in Pablo's imagination, the tranquility of rural life was not a destination, but a starting point. From a young age, he refused to accept the limits his environment imposed on him. He felt different, destined for something greater, something that would allow him to transcend the predictable life of the countryside. Unlike his father, who found dignity in working the land, Pablo saw it as a trap he wanted to escape at all costs. The countryside didn't offer the wealth or power he already craved. It was a little later, when the family moved to Envigado, a municipality near Medellin, that a crucial change occurred. He went from the relative peace of the countryside to the hustle and bustle of a city that was transforming at a dizzying pace in the 1950s and 60s. Medellin was a crucible of contradictions. On one hand, a growing industrial city with textile factories and a flourishing bourgeoisie. On the other, a magnet for thousands of peasants fleeing the brutality of la violencia, a civil conflict that had torn the country apart. These displaced people settled in the slums surrounding the city, creating poor, overcrowded neighborhoods without basic services. In this environment, frustration and hopelessness were a daily reality. The promise of the industrial city was not fulfilled for the majority. Education was a privilege, decent work a rarity, and social mobility almost a dream. For a young man with Pablo's boundless ambition, this landscape was a playground, not an obstacle. He watched the rich of Medellin in their luxurious cars and mansions and promised himself that one day he would have all that, but not through conventional means. The path of hard work and academic degrees that his mother so valued seemed too slow, too limited. His mindset was that of a strategist, a natural-born leader who saw opportunity in chaos. His personality was forged in this context. He was cunning, charismatic, and possessed an innate ability to persuade people. He could be charming and generous with those who admired him, but also relentless and vengeful with those who stood in his way. Even in school, his rebellious spirit was evident. Although not a bad student, he soon lost interest in the classroom. History and math lessons couldn't compete with the lessons of the street. At 17, without finishing high school, he decided to drop out to dedicate himself completely to his true calling, a life of crime. This decision, made with total conviction, not only distanced him from the conventional path, but also plunged him into the Medellin underworld, a world he would soon completely dominate. Pablo's path to power wasn't a sudden leap, but a methodical climb. His first crimes weren't the major heists or massive drug shipments that would later make him infamous. They were small-scale offenses, but each one was a link in the chain that built his empire. His first foray into crime was as macabre as it was pragmatic, stealing tombstones. Alongside his cousin Gustavo Gaviria, one of his most loyal partners from the beginning, he would sneak into cemeteries to steal headstones, which they would then polish and resell. This act, which for many would be sacrilegious, was simply a business for Pablo. It was a way to make quick money with relatively low risk. What this crime reveals about his character is not just his cunning, but an early lack of respect for morality and boundaries. A young man who steals from the dead has no qualms about stealing from the living. It was a sign of things to come. As his ambitions grew, so did his crimes. His next step was smuggling cigarettes and appliances. This was a more complex crime that required a network of collaborators, transportation routes, and the complicity of authorities. Here, Pablo began to develop the leadership and organizational skills that would later be fundamental. He was no longer a simple thief, he was a businessman. He moved between small merchants and corrupt officials, weaving a web of influence that allowed him to import contraband goods without being detected. The risk was greater, but so were the profits. This was a crucial step in his criminal evolution, as it taught him the value of structure, the loyalty of his men, and, above all, the power of corruption. But the crime that truly propelled him was car theft. Medellin was a booming city, and the number of cars was growing with the nascent middle class. Pablo, along with his cousin Gustavo and other partners, perfected the technique. They would steal cars, strip them down, change the chassis numbers, repaint them, and forge the documents to sell them as if they were new. This operation was very lucrative, but also very dangerous. The police at the time took car theft seriously. However, Pablo already had a strategy to mitigate the risk: intimidation. He began to use violence to protect his businesses. A partner who didn't hold up his end, a customer who complained, a cop who refused to be bribed. They all learned, often the hard way, that Pablo was not a man to be trifled with. Over time, his methods became more brutal. He didn't limit himself to property theft. He ventured into kidnapping, a practice that gave him a reputation as a dangerous and unscrupulous man. In 1971, Escobar was one of those responsible for the kidnapping and murder of Diego Echavarria Misas, a wealthy industrialist from Antioquia. The crime was a clear message to the Medellin elite. Power no longer resided only in inherited money or industry. It could be seized. This act put him on the authorities' radar, and it was around this time that he began to build his private army of thugs, young men from the poor neighborhoods who saw in him a Robin Hood figure, a leader who offered them a way out of misery. Pablo learned to corrupt the system. With the money he earned, he bought off police, judges, and prosecutors. The phrase plata o plomo, silver or lead, wasn't his official motto yet, but it was already his modus operandi. He offered million-dollar bribes to authorities. If they accepted, he gained their silence and complicity. If they refused, he eliminated them. Thus, corruption became a tool as important as violence in his arsenal. He learned that impunity was not a gift, but a commodity that could be bought. This not only allowed him to operate freely, but also weakened the fabric of Colombian society from its foundations. Over time, these criminal activities became more sophisticated and intertwined. Cigarette smuggling transformed into drug smuggling. Stolen cars were no longer just for selling, but for moving merchandise and evading authorities. The network of thugs he recruited for kidnapping became the security force of a burgeoning criminal empire. By the mid-1970s, Pablo Escobar was no longer a petty delinquent. He was an organized criminal, a leader who had honed his skills on the streets, and who now, with an insatiable appetite for wealth and power, was ready to take the leap into the most lucrative business in the world: cocaine. The path from poverty to the pinnacle of crime was already paved, and his first great adventure, drug trafficking, was about to begin. To understand how Pablo Escobar went from being a petty criminal to a drug lord, it's crucial to analyze the political and social context of 20th century Colombia. The country was not a unified and peaceful state. It was a hotbed of conflicts that would lay the groundwork for the explosion of drug trafficking. The backdrop to his rise was La Violencia, a period of undeclared civil war between the liberal and conservative parties that lasted from approximately 1948 to the mid-1950s. This conflict, which claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, plunged the country into unprecedented chaos, especially in rural areas. Terrified peasants were forced to flee their lands and seek refuge in large cities like Medellin, swelling the slums. This massive exodus created a desperate and cheap labor force, as well as an impoverished and resentful social base that would become the recruiting ground for future kingpins. Endemic corruption, the weakness of state institutions, and the lack of government presence in vast areas of the rural territory allowed armed groups, both guerrillas and paramilitaries, to flourish. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC, and other guerrilla organizations born from peasant and communist movements took control of large swaths of jungle and rural land. Although not directly involved in drug trafficking in their early days, they began to levy attacks on peasants who grew marijuana and later coca, creating a parallel, illicit economy. It was in this breeding ground that the drug business could thrive. The demand for marijuana in the United States had begun to grow in the 60s, but in the following decade, the market for cocaine, a more potent and easily transportable drug, exploded. Colombia's geographical conditions, with its ideal climate and soil for cultivating the coca plant, made it the world's production center, and its location, strategically close to the United States, made it the perfect launching point for the industry. Escobar's transition from petty crime to drug trafficking was not instantaneous. It began with marijuana. With his established smuggling network, it wasn't difficult for him to start moving shipments of this drug. However, it wasn't until he met figures like Griselda Blanco, known as the godmother of cocaine, that he realized where the real money was. Griselda, a ruthless and ambitious woman, taught Pablo the intricacies of the cocaine business. She opened the doors to the Miami market for him, an epicenter of partying and drug consumption in the 1970s. Pablo, with his business acumen, didn't want to be a mere transporter. He saw the opportunity to control the entire supply chain, from the cultivation of the coca leaf in the fields to the distribution of the white powder on the streets of the United States. His first steps in cocaine were humble. He was involved in transporting coca paste, the raw material, to clandestine processing labs. But he quickly began to cut out the middlemen. Instead of just receiving the paste, he bought it directly from Peru and Bolivia, processed it on his own properties, and transported it himself to its final destination. This vertical integration of the business not only maximized his profits, but also gave him unprecedented control over the quality and flow of the drug. To expand his business, Pablo invested in a fleet of small planes and speedboats. The pilots flew low, under the radar, to evade authorities. They often used routes that passed through Caribbean islands where there was no strong police presence. By the late 1970s, Pablo had established a trafficking operation so efficient and lucrative that he was no longer just another trafficker. He was a leader in the nascent world of drug trafficking. As the business grew, the need for a more formal structure became apparent. Pablo Escobar, along with his cousin Gustavo Gaviria, joined forces with other powerful criminals of the era to form the Medellín Cartel. The names that would form the core of the cartel are synonymous with brutality and boundless ambition. Gonzalo Rodríguez Gacha, Gonzalo Rodríguez Gacha, El Mexicano, a man with a fascination for Aztec culture and a talent for violence. And the Ochoa brothers, Fabio, Jorge Luis, and Juan David, a family of cattle ranchers who provided the infrastructure and connections necessary for smuggling. Together, these men transformed cocaine trafficking into a globalized industry. The cartel's expansion was based on a combination of innovation and extreme violence. They didn't limit themselves to traditional routes. They explored and mastered new methods for moving the drug, from tugboats pulling small submarines loaded with cocaine to the use of large cargo planes landing on clandestine airstrips in the jungle. The audacity of their operations was as great as their profits. Soon, the Medellín Cartel controlled a significant portion of the global cocaine traffic, generating revenues of up to $70 million a day. The exponential growth of the cartel would not have been possible without the collaboration of key figures in the world of smuggling. One of the most important characters in this machine was Carlos Leder, a Colombian German with a unique vision for the business. After serving a sentence in a U.S. prison, Leder joined Escobar and became obsessed with the idea of using the Bahamas as a transit point. In 1978, Leder bought the island of Norman's Cay, turned it into his personal fiefdom, and built an airstrip and warehouses. For several years, the island became the cartel's main refueling hub, where Escobar's large cargo planes would land, and the drugs would be transferred to smaller planes to evade detection and enter the United States. The operation was so successful that it made Leder and his partners multi-millionaires, and the image of Norman's Cay as a cocaine paradise became a symbol of the cartel's power. Another crucial partner was the American pilot Barry Seal. Seal was a veteran airline pilot who had realized that the profits from cocaine far surpassed those from marijuana. By 1981, he had established a systematic smuggling operation using a dozen small planes that flew low to avoid radar in U.S. airspace. Seal's team would drop packages of cocaine at agreed-upon sites in rural areas of Louisiana, where another team on the ground would pick them up and distribute them through the cartel's network on the East Coast. Seal's work was instrumental in the cartel's expansion in the United States, but it became a double-edged sword. In 1983, he was captured by the DEA and became an informant for the U.S. government, revealing crucial details about Escobar's operations. When the cartel discovered his betrayal, they ordered his assassination in 1986, a clear message about the fate of traitors. The structure of the Medellín Cartel was not a simple hierarchy. It was a network of alliances and subcontracting. Pablo was the undisputed leader, el patrón, but his partners, like the Ochoa brothers and Gacha, had their own operations and their own spheres of influence. This made the cartel incredibly difficult to dismantle. As if one part of the network fell, the rest could continue to function. To protect their vast earnings, the cartel developed highly sophisticated money laundering methods, buying properties, businesses, and large quantities of gold to convert their illicit profits into clean money. However, the profits were so exorbitant that they couldn't spend or launder them fast enough. It is estimated that at one point, up to 10% of their money was lost or destroyed, a sum equivalent to billions of dollars, simply because they couldn't hide or store it. This led to the famous anecdote that they spent thousands of dollars a week just on rubber bands to organize the stacks of cash. By the late 1980s, the Medellín Cartel had become a criminal entity unprecedented in history. Its power was not just measured in money, but also in the social and political control it exerted. Pablo and his partners had managed to create a state within a state, with its own laws, its own army, and its own economy. The consolidation of this power was the culmination of a process that began with petty theft and was catapulted by a chaotic political environment and the unquenchable ambition of Pablo Escobar. With the Medellín Cartel in full swing, Pablo Escobar's accumulation of wealth reached levels that defied imagination. Money flowed in torrents, faster than he and his associates could count it, spend it, or even hide it. His fortune became so obscene that it turned into a logistical problem. It's estimated that at its peak, the Medellín Cartel was generating over $60 million a day, which translated to nearly $25 billion a year. The money arrived in bales, in bags, in boxes, and became such a heavy burden that, according to his own brother Roberto, up to 10% of the total earnings was lost or eaten by rats. An astonishing sum that, even when lost, surpassed the fortunes of many legitimate billionaires. The money was hidden in the walls of houses, in basements, in fields, buried underground, in places few would suspect. In an anecdote that now seems like something out of a movie, the cartel set up a mansion for a poor family under one strange condition. They would have to leave the house from time to time. The reason was simple. The property's jacuzzi had a secret compartment underneath where tens of millions of dollars were stored. Over time, this family's home became the clandestine meeting point for Escobar's accountants, who moved stacks and stacks of cash amidst the daily life of an innocent family who had no idea what their house was hiding. And the money just kept pouring in. With a portion of this fortune, Pablo embarked on the construction of his private kingdom. The most ostentatious symbol of his power was Hacienda Nápoles, a 20 square kilometer complex near Puerto Triunfo, 150 kilometers from Medellin. It wasn't just an estate, but a personal paradise where Escobar could live like a king and project an image of absolute power. The property included a Spanish colonial-style mansion, a private airstrip for his guests, not for illicit business, a sculpture park with replicas of dinosaurs, a bull ring, and even a go-kart track. But the crown jewel and the most eccentric detail was his private zoo. Escobar imported a collection of exotic animals from all over the world: zebras, antelopes, elephants, giraffes, ostriches, and ponies. But undoubtedly the most famous were the hippos. Fascinated by these creatures, Pablo acquired a dozen of them, never imagining that his personal whim would have lasting environmental consequences. After the fall of his empire, the hippos escaped and reproduced in the wild, creating the only wild hippopotamus population outside of Africa, a biological legacy that the Colombian government still doesn't know how to manage. Hacienda Nápoles was a monument to his ego, a demonstration that there were no limits to his power or his extravagances. But Escobar's empire wasn't limited to Colombia. His reach was global. In the late 1970s, he managed to acquire a huge pink mansion in Miami Beach, Florida, registered in his own name. The fact that he could own such a visible property in the heart of his main drug market without U.S. authorities detecting or arresting him is a testament to the relative obscurity in which he operated in his early days and the power of his money. He also acquired a large estate on Isla Grande, the largest island in the Rosario Islands archipelago in the Colombian Caribbean, equipped with a mansion, apartments, pools, and a helipad. These properties were not just a status symbol, they were operational centers, though often used only to hide money or as meeting points for the cartel. Escobar's power and fortune did not grant him total immunity. There was a ghost that haunted him: extradition. In September 1979, the Colombian government, under pressure from the United States, signed an extradition treaty with President Jimmy Carter's administration. This agreement, which came into effect in March 1982, allowed Colombian drug traffickers operating on U.S. soil to be sent to the United States to be tried and imprisoned. For Pablo, this wasn't just a legal threat, it was a death sentence. The Colombian judicial system at the time was a sieve. Corruption was so widespread that Escobar knew that even if he were arrested, he could bribe judges, prosecutors, and prison officials to escape a serious conviction or, in the worst-case scenario, serve a sentence in luxurious conditions. In the United States, however, the system was relentless. There were no bribes, no comforts. A conviction would mean a life sentence in a maximum security prison far from his family, his money, and his power. The specter of a high-security cell in the United States became his greatest fear. In response, he launched an all-out war against the state. The motto of his war was simple and brutal: plata o plomo, silver or lead. You either accepted his money, his bribe, or you got a bullet. There was no middle ground. Escobar and his men began a campaign of systematic terror. Judges who refused to rule in his favor were assassinated. Police officers who dared to investigate him were executed in the streets. Politicians who spoke out against him were intimidated. From the mid-1980s onward, this motto became the unwritten law of Colombia. The campaign of terror sought not only to protect his business but to force the government to repeal the extradition treaty. At the same time he was waging a war, Pablo also tried to legitimize himself in the public eye. He cultivated the image of a modern-day Robin Hood. In a country plagued by poverty and inequality, he presented himself as the savior of the dispossessed. He built soccer fields, schools, hospitals, and housing in the poorest neighborhoods of Medellin. He gave away cash, toys at Christmas, and created jobs. His popularity in the slums was immense. They saw him as a benefactor who did what the government didn't. For the common people, the harm from drug trafficking was happening in the United States, an imperialist country that many did not feel was their own. This populism, though cynical, bought him the loyalty of a desperate populace. With this popular support, Escobar decided to take the boldest step of his life: enter politics. In 1982, he ran as a candidate for the Colombian Liberal Party. His campaign focused on extradition, arguing that the treaty was a betrayal of Colombia's national sovereignty. His strategy was twofold: use the political platform to fight against extradition from within, and at the same time, protect himself with parliamentary immunity. But the audacity of his move was his downfall. His entry into Congress exposed his criminality in a way that the political elite could no longer ignore. His main antagonist was Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, a young and courageous lawyer who had just been appointed Minister of Justice by the new president, Belisario Betancourt. Lara Bonilla launched a relentless campaign against the drug lords. With the support of the president, who was determined to confront the cartels, Lara Bonilla publicly unmasked Escobar as the head of the Medellín Cartel, denouncing his vast fortune and illicit activities. In 1983, the newspaper El Espectador published an extensive report detailing Escobar's criminal history, including his 1,976 arrest. This unleashed Pablo's fury. His initial reaction was panic and rage. He tried to silence the newspaper by buying all the copies and considered assassinating the editor, but the damage was already done. The Robin Hood reputation began to crumble in public opinion. To make matters worse, his personal life was also exposed. The press revealed his romantic relationship with the famous television presenter Virginia Vallejo. This scandal not only put him in the public eye in a way he detested, but also caused a crisis in his marriage with his wife, Maria, who kicked him out of the house. Although the relationship with Vallejo continued intermittently, the incident showed that his once hermetic world was fracturing. The pressure became unbearable. The superior judge of Medellin, Gustavo Zuluaga, reopened the 1976 case. The U.S. Embassy canceled his visa. Finally, Congress, under pressure from Lara Bonilla, voted to revoke his parliamentary immunity. Defeated in the political game, Escobar had no choice but to resign his seat in January 1984. In his resignation letter, he presented himself as a martyr, a fighter against the oligarchy and injustice. It was a defiant exit, but the reality was that he had failed in his attempt to legitimize his power. His next step would be violence. On the 30th of April 1984, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla was shot and killed in his car on the streets of Bogotá by Escobar's hitmen. This act, a declaration of total war, sealed Pablo's fate and that of Colombia. No more political games. There was only silver or lead. The assassination of Rodrigo Lara Bonilla on the 30th of April 1984 marked a turning point. It wasn't simply the murder of a minister, it was a declaration of war. With that act, Pablo Escobar transformed from an organized criminal into a state-sponsored terrorist. The Colombian government, now led by President Virgilio Barco, responded with an even tougher stance, and the institutions rose to meet the head-on challenge of narco-terrorism. One of the first signs of this new determination came in January 1987, when police units intercepted a convoy of vehicles carrying Escobar's family. While Pablo, who was traveling in another car, was not captured, his wife Maria Victoria and their children, Juan Pablo and Manuela, were arrested and held for several hours. The message was clear. The state was willing to attack Escobar at his most vulnerable point, his family. This intensification of the conflict didn't just come from the government. Escobar's enemies were multiplying, and the war was now being fought on multiple fronts. One of the fiercest and bloodiest battles was the one he waged against his former allies and, by extension, his new rivals, the Cali Cartel. In the city of Cali, in southwestern Colombia, the Orejuela brothers, Gilberto and Miguel, along with José Santa Cruz Londoño and Helmer Pacho Herrera, had built their own cocaine empire, known for being more discreet and businesslike. Initially, both cartels had collaborated and divided the markets in the United States. However, by the mid-1980s, tensions erupted when Gonzalo Rodríguez Gacha, El Mexicano, one of Escobar's top lieutenants, tried to seize control of the lucrative New York routes, a territory that had been ceded to the Cali Cartel. The dispute over territory escalated into an all-out war, unleashing a wave of assassinations and bombings. Hitmen from both sides clashed in the streets of Medellin and Cali. The private violence between the cartels was as brutal as the war Escobar was waging against the government. In 1988, a daring operation by the Cali Cartel managed to detonate a car bomb in the affluent neighborhood where Escobar lived just outside Medellin, an attack that brought the war to his own doorstep. This conflict, coupled with his confrontation with the state, pushed Escobar to the brink. His empire, though at the peak of its wealth, was under siege from all sides. While the cartels fought each other and the government, Colombia sank into a spiral of violence that made it the most dangerous country in the world. The homicide figures were simply terrifying. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Medellin was the murder capital of the world. In 1991, the city, with a population of over 1.5 million people, recorded 7,237 murders, an average of 18 homicides a day, translating to a rate of 266 murders per 100,000 inhabitants. In 1991, there were over 25,000 violent deaths, a figure that rose to 27,000 inches, 1,992. This meant an average of 70 violent deaths a day, or one person murdered every 20 minutes. Colombia had become a failed state, and Pablo Escobar's hand was behind a large part of that violence. Despite his efforts to maintain his Robin Hood image, Escobar's brutality became so indiscriminate that he could no longer hide it. The money he generated from cocaine allowed him to finance not only social works but also terrorism on an industrial scale. A notable example was his investment in soccer. In the early 1980s, Escobar injected massive sums of money into Medellin's soccer team, Atlético Nacional, transforming it from a mid-table team into a title contender. He bought the best players and financed the club in such a way that in 1989, Atlético Nacional won the Copa Libertadores, the most important club tournament in South America. For Pablo, this investment had multiple benefits. It won him the unconditional support of the fans and allowed him to launder millions of dollars through illegal betting. However, even this avenue of legitimization would eventually be blocked when soccer authorities, under pressure, began to take measures against the influence of drug trafficking. Escobar's terrorism reached its peak in the final months of 1989, when he launched a series of massive attacks that showed his total disregard for the lives of innocents. These acts were not only intended to kill his enemies but to sow terror throughout Colombian society. On the 27th of November 1989, Avianca Flight 203, a commercial flight with 107 passengers on board, took off from Bogotá, bound for Cali. 5 minutes after takeoff, a bomb detonated on board, killing everyone on the plane and 3 more on the ground. The subsequent investigation revealed that Escobar had ordered the attack in a desperate attempt to kill César Gaviria Trujillo, the presidential candidate who had risen to replace his mentor, Luis Carlos Galán, who had been assassinated on Escobar's orders 3 months earlier. Gaviria, who had positioned himself as the candidate with the toughest stance against the cartels, had been tipped off that Escobar's hitmen believed he would be on that flight for a campaign meeting. But fate, or chance, played in Gaviria's favor. He changed his plans at the last minute and did not board the plane. The brutality of the attack, which killed 107 innocent people in an attempt to eliminate a single man, shocked the world. Just 2 weeks later, on the 6th of December 1989, Escobar ordered another attack. A truck bomb loaded with half a ton of dynamite exploded outside the headquarters of the Administrative Department of Security, DAS, Colombia's main intelligence agency, in Bogotá. The target was General Miguel Alfredo Maza Márquez, the director of the agency who had led the fight against the Medellín Cartel. The explosion was so massive that it blew off the facade of the building and destroyed dozens of city blocks around it. The attack killed 57 people and injured more than 2,000, most of them innocent civilians who were working or passing through the area. These acts of terror, in which the intent to kill extended to anyone who was near his target, demonstrated that Escobar no longer had any moral limits. The Robin Hood had disappeared, leaving only a mass murderer. The war against Gaviria's government, the betrayals of the Cali cartel, and the attrition of his own people led Escobar to an untenable situation. The world saw him as a monster. The international pressure was immense. In the midst of this chaos, however, an unexpected turn occurred in Colombian politics. In 1991, the country enacted a new constitution, and under the influence of bribes, threats, and the terror of the drug traffickers, the Constituent Assembly included an article that prohibited the extradition of Colombian citizens. For Escobar, this clause was a monumental victory. The ghost that had haunted him for years had been exorcised. With the fear of extradition eliminated, Pablo saw an opportunity to negotiate his surrender and end the war. In mid-1991, after months of secret negotiations, an agreement was reached. Escobar would surrender to the government, hand over his vast arsenal, and serve a sentence of no more than 5 years. The only condition, one that only he could ask for and get, was that he would serve his sentence in a prison that he himself would build. The government, exhausted by the war and desperate for peace, accepted. It was a total capitulation by the authorities. Thus was born La Cathedral, a luxury complex that Escobar built on a hilltop overlooking his beloved Medellin. It was not a prison. It was a mockery of the Colombian judicial system, sarcastically known as Hotel Escobar. The place had all the amenities a man of his status could desire: a soccer field, a jacuzzi, an artificial waterfall, a well-stocked bar, a private telephone line, and even a telescope to spy on his enemies and see his family from a distance. Escobar was not a prisoner. He was a host, a king in his own castle. He received his family, his associates, and even celebrities. From there, he continued to run the cartel's operations, closing deals, and, it is rumored, even ordering murders. The most notorious case was that of 2 of his lieutenants, the Moncada brothers, whom he personally murdered within the walls of La Catedral. Instead of being confined, he was strengthening himself, protected from the government and his enemies by the prison's isolated and fortified location. The agreement, which was supposed to restore peace, became a national humiliation for Colombia. The press, which had been silenced for years by terror, began to leak details about Escobar's luxurious life in La Catedral. Photos of parties, visits from prostitutes, and the constant coming and going of his associates outraged the public. The Gaviria administration, under immense pressure, decided it had to act. In July 1992, the government planned an operation to move Escobar to a military prison. But the plan to move Pablo was so poorly conceived that the news reached his ears. Finding himself cornered, he decided he would not let them lock him up again. On the 22nd of July 1992, with the help of his men and thanks to an escape tunnel he had built behind a false wall in the bathroom, Pablo Escobar escaped from his own prison. The escape from La Catedral was the final act of his arrogance, the ultimate mockery of the state that had let him operate for so long. The war, which was supposed to be over, had just begun again. But this time, it would be a war to the death, a manhunt that would not stop until El Patron was captured or killed. Pablo Escobar's escape from La Catedral on the 22nd of July 1992 was the ultimate act of arrogance that sealed his fate. By escaping from his luxury prison, he showed that he considered himself above any law, any agreement. But in reality, he had trapped himself in a labyrinth with no way out, a dead-end street. His escape was not the beginning of a new era of impunity, but the starting gun for an unprecedented manhunt. This time, the Colombian government, aware of the humiliation it had suffered, would show no mercy. And for the first time, Colombian security forces would have the unrestricted support of U.S. intelligence and special operations agencies. President Cesar Gaviria Trujillo, after the failure of the agreement, was determined to capture Escobar, dead or alive. To achieve this, the Colombian National Police revived and strengthened the elite unit created years earlier, the Search Block. This group, composed of the best officers, was trained and equipped with state-of-the-art technology for the mission. But they were not alone. Behind them, operating secretly on Colombian soil, were elite teams from the United States Special Forces, including members of Delta Force and SEAL Team 6, the U.S. government, frustrated by years of impunity and viewing narco-terrorism as a direct threat, sent its best men with the mission of providing intelligence, technological tracking, and tactical support to the Colombian operations. The collaboration was so close that it became a lethal synergy. The Colombians provided knowledge of the terrain and a network of human intelligence, while the Americans provided the technology, primarily sophisticated tracking systems to triangulate the signal from cell phones, a key tool in the hunt. But the hunt was not just a military operation. It had become an all-out war that attracted other participants, some of whom were as brutal as Escobar himself. A new vigilante group known as Los Pepes emerged with a single objective: to eliminate Pablo and his organization. The name, an acronym for People Persecuted by Pablo Escobar, included relatives of victims of his attacks, but also a dark alliance of former right-wing paramilitaries and, crucially, members of the Cali Cartel. While the search bloc and U.S. forces tracked Escobar, Los Pepes waged their own war of terror, but in reverse. They attacked Escobar's properties, murdered his hitmen, his lawyers, his accountants, and anyone who had a connection to him to force him out of hiding. The violence fed on itself. Escobar would assassinate allies of the Cali Cartel, and Los Pepes would respond by killing his men, often in gruesome ways, leaving their bodies in the street with messages. This tacit alliance, a pact with the devil, led to Escobar's downfall. His world was shrinking daily, his circle of loyalty was vanishing, and paranoia was taking over. After his escape, Escobar was constantly on the move, hiding in a series of safe houses in Medellin. Despite the pressure, he refused to leave the country he felt was his. His arrogance remained intact. Shortly after escaping, he even gave an interview to a local radio station in which he mocked the government and boasted of his escape, though he also made it clear that he was willing to negotiate a new surrender. But the offer was ignored. The hunt intensified. In the following months, the search bloc, using cold tracking technology from the DEA, came close to capturing him several times. In December 1992, during one of the raids, they found that Escobar had escaped just hours earlier. But the net was tightening. As his associates were killed by Los Pepes or surrendered to the authorities, his support evaporated. The death of his brother-in-law at the hands of Los Pepes was a personal blow that showed him his world was collapsing. Cornered, without resources, and with his family far from him, Pablo became more reckless. Communication with his wife and children, who were hidden in a safe house in Bogotá, became a vital necessity for him. It was this necessity that would seal his fate. On the 2nd of December 1993, the search bloc, in collaboration with U.S. agents, triangulated a call from his cell phone. The signal came from a house in the Los Olivos neighborhood, a middle-class area in Medellin. The intelligence was confirmed. A team of 8 men from the search bloc stormed the house. Pablo and his last bodyguard, Álvaro de Jesús Agudelo, known as El Limón, were inside. Hearing the noise, they both ran to the roof of the house, trying to escape across the roofs of neighboring houses. What happened next is the subject of a debate that persists to this day. Moments later, Pablo Escobar lay lifeless on the rooftop, with gunshot wounds to his leg, torso, and a fatal shot to the ear. The official version, the one that was spread in the media and defended by the Colombian police commanders who participated in the operation, is that he was killed in combat. An officer, Hugo Aguilar, was responsible for the shot to the ear that killed him, which earned him recognition as the hero who brought down Escobar. But there is another version, one that has gained strength over time and adds a touch of drama to the end of his life. His brother, Roberto Escobar, and other close associates have claimed that Pablo, true to his promise of never being extradited, took his own life. Roberto has recounted on several occasions that his brother always said that if he was ever cornered with no way out, he would shoot himself in the ear to avoid capture. The fatal gunshot wound to the ear gives this theory a chilling verisimilitude. The debate over the truth behind his death will probably never be resolved. But the result for Colombia and the world was the same. On the 2nd of December 1993, just one day after his 44th birthday, the man known as El Patrón lay dead on a rooftop. On the day of Escobar's death, thousands of people took to the streets of Medellin to mourn his loss. His funeral, attended by more than 25,000 people, was seen as a manifestation of the Robin Hood image he had built. For many, the violence didn't matter. What mattered was the man who had built soccer fields, given away money, and defied the government that had abandoned them. With the main leader of the Medellín Cartel out of the equation, the empire he had built crumbled. For a time, the Cali Cartel became the main trafficking organization, but their reign was short-lived. By the mid-1990s, their leaders were captured or killed. Power fragmented, and new organizations, like the Norte del Valle Cartel, took control. The drug trafficking business adapted, shifting its smuggling routes towards Mexico, which became the new bridge between Colombia and the United States, giving rise to the powerful Mexican cartels. Escobar's legacy in Colombia was a country transformed by bloodshed. On one hand, he left a traumatized society with the scars of thousands of murders, kidnappings, and bombings. The violence he unleashed became ingrained and took decades to dissipate. However, his death also marked a turning point. With the decline of the Medellín Cartel, the city he had terrorized began to heal. Over the years, Medellín has undergone an incredible urban and social transformation. The city, once the murder capital of the world, is now internationally acclaimed for its social innovation, its public transportation, the metro and cable cars, and its public spaces. Places like Hacienda Nápoles have become theme parks that attract tourists, and La Cathedral, his luxury prison, was converted into a monastery by Benedictine monks, an ironic end for a place of evil. Pablo Escobar was undoubtedly an enigmatic figure. He grew up in poverty and refused to accept the limits of his origins, using his charisma and ambition to build an empire. One could argue that he was a product of his time, a reflection of a deeply unequal society fractured by violence. He helped the poor, built community projects, and confronted a state that, in his perception, was corrupt and subservient to the interests of foreign powers. He himself claimed to be just a decent man who sold flowers. But the reality is that the man behind the myth was a ruthless mass murderer, a terrorist who used indiscriminate violence to achieve his goals. The prosperity he brought to some was bought with the blood of others. The bombings of Avianca Flight 203 and the Das building, which killed more than 160 innocent people, proved that he had no scruples. The country he claimed to love was plunged into a violence that left more than 25,000 dead in a single year. The peace and prosperity that Medellin enjoys today could only begin after his malevolent influence was eliminated. So, who really was Pablo Escobar? Was he the Colombian Robin Hood who tried to be a popular leader, giving a voice to the disadvantaged? Or was he simply a merciless killer, a criminal of the highest order who used terror for his own benefit?